The drawing-room of Ashworth Manor fell silent as Mrs. Eleanor Ashworth's scream pierced through the festive cheer of Christmas Eve. Her prize Norman turkey, the centrepiece of tomorrow's grand feast, worth over £200 and destined for the table of the Prime Minister himself, had vanished without trace from the locked kitchen larder. Detective Inspector Japp arrived within the hour, his weathered face creasing with frustration as he surveyed the scene. The larder door bore no signs of forced entry. The key remained in Mrs. Ashworth's possession throughout the evening. 3 servants had been present in the kitchen between 6 and 8 o'clock when the theft occurred, yet none had witnessed anything suspicious. The bird simply ceased to exist and spirited away like a magician's illusion in a room where magic should be impossible. What perplexed Japp most profoundly, however, was the peculiar clue left behind on the marble preparation table where the turkey had rested. Beside the empty serving platter lay a single item, a child's wooden toy soldier, painted in vivid red and gold, its paint slightly chipped, its origins utterly mysterious. No one in the household recognised it. The servants denied placing it there. Mrs. Ashworth had never seen it before. Yet there it stood, deliberate and inexplicable, as though deliberately positioned to mock the investigators' efforts. The locked larder presented an additional nightmare for conventional detective work. The single window, reinforced with iron bars, remained secured from the inside. The ventilation shaft, barely 6 inches in diameter, could accommodate nothing larger than a cat. The only entrance was the door itself, and Mrs. Ashworth had kept the key on her person from the moment she locked the larder at 5:30 until she discovered the theft at 8 o'clock. The household itself seemed equally bewildering. Mrs. Ashworth's nephew, Charles, a gambling man, but perpetually short of funds, had arrived only yesterday from London. The cook, Margaret, had worked for the family for 15 years without incident. The scullery maid, Iris, had been employed for merely 3 months and possessed a nervous disposition that suggested guilt. Yet her movements that evening had been documented by the other servants. The butler, Graves, had been arranging place cards in the dining room throughout the critical period. When Scotland Yard's preliminary investigation yielded nothing but contradictions and impossible scenarios, Mrs. Ashworth made a desperate decision. She sent an urgent telegram to the one man whose reputation suggested he might untangle what appeared fundamentally unsolvable, Hercule Poirot, the legendary Belgian detective, currently residing in London for the holiday season. The case file reached Poirot's sitting room as evening descended over Christmas Eve. The locked larder, the vanished turkey, the mysterious toy soldier, all of it seemed simultaneously trivial and perplexing. Yet as Poirot arranged his papers with methodical precision, his mind began working with characteristic intensity. Japp had focused entirely upon the impossible circumstances of the theft itself, overlooking perhaps the most vital question of all. Why anyone would steal a turkey in such an elaborate manner when simpler alternatives existed. The toy soldier fascinated him particularly. It was no random object. Such items possessed history, belonged somewhere, meant something to someone. Poirot's fingers traced its painted surface thoughtfully. Tomorrow he would travel to Ashworth Manor. The Christmas turkey mystery would be solved, he decided with absolute certainty. Not through the investigation of locked doors and impossible circumstances, but through the exploration of human nature, motivation, and that most telling of all the detective's tools, the psychology of the criminal mind itself. The game, as they say, was afoot. Poirot arrived at Ashworth Manor on Christmas morning, stepping from his motor car with a deliberate grace of a man who understood the theatrical importance of his own entrance. Inspector Japp stood waiting on the frost-covered gravel, his expression a mixture of relief and resigned scepticism. He had encountered Poirot before, and knew the Belgian detective's methods would prove either brilliantly illuminating or unnecessarily complicated, quite possibly both, simultaneously. Mrs. Ashworth received him in the drawing-room, her composure maintained through evident effort. She was a woman accustomed to control, and the theft had shattered her carefully constructed world. Poirot observed her hands trembling slightly as she offered him tea, noted how her eyes avoided direct contact when discussing the missing bird, and registered the precise moment her jaw tightened when he casually mentioned the toy soldier. "You have examined the larder thoroughly, I presume?" Poirot inquired of Japp, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that characteristic manner. "Every inch," Japp confirmed irritably. No hidden passages, no concealed entrances, the door was locked, the key accounted for. It's as though the turkey simply dissolved into thin air. Poirot rose without comment and made his way to the kitchen, where he requested that the larder remain exactly as it had been discovered. The room itself interested him far less than its inhabitants. He studied each servant carefully, watching their reactions as he moved about the marble preparation tables where the turkey had rested. The cook, Margaret, maintained composure, but her breathing became slightly shallow. The scullery maid, Iris, wrung her hands nervously, though this seemed her natural state. The butler, Graves, regarded Poirot with professional detachment, yet it was Charles Ashworth who commanded Poirot's primary attention. The nephew lounged against the kitchen doorframe with studied casualness, his expensive cigarette case visible in his pocket, his cufflinks bearing the marks of recent pawnings and repurchasing. When Poirot reached for the toy soldier, Charles's pupils dilated fractionally, a response he attempted to conceal by turning toward the window. "Monsieur Charles," Poirot began conversationally, holding the wooden figure toward the light. "This charming soldier belonged to whom, would you say?" "Haven't the faintest idea," Charles replied. His voice perhaps slightly too bright. "Could belong to anyone. Could have been here for years." But Poirot noticed what others had missed entirely. Beneath Charles's fingernail, barely visible unless one possessed Poirot's obsessive attention to minutiae, lay a fragment of the same distinctive red paint that adorned the toy. "Soldier." Furthermore, when Poirot casually remarked that the theft must have required considerable planning and insider knowledge, Charles's jaw betrayed the slightest involuntary clench, the physical manifestation of guilt attempting to remain concealed behind social pretense. Later, examining the larder more thoroughly, Poirot discovered something equally intriguing. The stone floor bore faint scratch marks near the preparation table, marks too subtle for casual observation, but perfectly visible to one who understood that criminals, however clever, invariably disturbed the physical environment. Something heavy had been dragged, something of considerable weight and dimension. When Poirot returned to the drawing room, his eyes held that peculiar gleam that Inspector Japp recognized with mingled dread and anticipation. The Belgian detective had perceived something fundamental that conventional investigation had overlooked. The locked door, the impossible circumstances, the vanished turkey. None of these constituted the genuine mystery. The authentic puzzle lay elsewhere entirely, hidden beneath layers of misdirection and carefully constructed deception. "Inspector," Poirot announced quietly, "believe we have been examining this crime from precisely the wrong perspective. The turkey has not vanished, it has been hidden, and the person responsible stands closer than we might imagine." Japp leaned forward, his skepticism momentarily suspended by Poirot's certainty. The detective settled into a leather armchair with theatrical deliberation, gesturing for the inspector to summon each household member individually. The interrogation would commence immediately, he declared, before Christmas dinner could provide convenient opportunities for coordinated stories to solidify into unshakable falsehoods. Margaret the cook entered first, her apron still dusted with flour from morning preparations. When asked to recount her movements between 6 and 8 o'clock, she spoke with practiced precision, describing her work preparing vegetables, her consultation with Mrs. Ashworth regarding tomorrow's menu, her brief absence to collect additional kindling from the storage shed. Yet when Poirot casually inquired whether she had observed Charles near the kitchen during this period, a faint hesitation preceded her denial. Her fingers twisted the apron's hem, a gesture of anxiety barely concealed. "You're certain?" Poirot pressed gently. "Absolutely certain that young Monsieur Charles did not enter the kitchen tomorrow evening?" "Quite certain, sir," Margaret insisted, though her voice carried the thin quality of manufactured confidence. Graves, the butler, presented an entirely different demeanour. He answered Poirot's questions with unflappable precision, his narrative accounting for his exact whereabouts throughout the critical hours. Yet his eyes betrayed something Japp initially missed, but Poirot registered instantly not guilt but knowledge. Graves knew more than he had revealed, maintained secrets beyond mere professional discretion. When Poirot mentioned having observed paint beneath Charles's fingernail, Graves's composure fractured for a single revealing moment before reasserting itself. Iris, the scullery maid, proved far more transparent. She wept openly when questioned, her nervous disposition collapsing entirely under interrogation. She confessed to seeing Charles carry something wrapped in burlap toward the wine cellar at approximately 7 o'clock. Though he had instructed her severely to maintain silence, she had remained quiet, she explained, because Charles had been kind to her, had slipped her extra coin on occasion, and she feared causing him trouble. Her testimony tumbled forth in anxious profusion, each word seeming to cost her considerable emotional effort. When Charles himself was summoned his studied casualness had evaporated entirely. He attempted to maintain composure, but his responses became increasingly contradictory. First he claimed never to have entered the kitchen. Subsequently, when confronted with Iris's testimony, he admitted entering briefly but insisted he had merely retrieved a forgotten item. Finally, his veneer cracked completely. "It was a debt," he blurted, his voice taking on desperate urgency. "A gambling debt to a man named Harrigan. Rather vicious fellow. He demanded the turkey more specifically. Said it would serve as collateral, proof I could deliver something of value. I panicked, thought if I could simply move it somewhere temporarily, hide it until the debt could be settled through other means." Yet Poirot raised a hand, silencing him mid-explanation. The detective's eyes held that peculiar brightness that suggested the truth remained more complex than Charles's admission suggested. He turned toward Japp with deliberate slowness. "Inspector, observe how Monsieur Charles assumes we accept his account of desperation and theft. He confesses to the obvious crime while obscuring the genuine transgression entirely. Notice also how Margaret's denial proved somewhat too vehement, and how our butler Graves possesses knowledge he has deliberately withheld." Poirot's fingers pressed together thoughtfully. "The turkey exists. Somewhere within this manor it awaits discovery, but its location will reveal far more than a simple theft. The toy soldier, you see, was not placed there by Monsieur Charles. It belonged to someone else entirely, someone whose involvement runs considerably deeper than mere complicity in a young man's foolish scheme." Japp's face darkened with confusion as Poirot's implications became apparent. The inspector to assume the case concluded with Charles's confession, yet the Belgian detective's tone suggested they had merely glimpsed the surface of far deeper currents. Poirot rose and began pacing, his hands clasped behind his back in that characteristic pose of intense concentration. "Consider the motives, if you please," Poirot continued, addressing both Japp and the assembled household members who had been summoned back into the drawing-room. "Monsieur Charles requires money desperately, this we have established. Yet his method seems curiously laborious for a simple theft. Why not simply steal the turkey outright and sell it to a fence? Why involve this Harrigan fellow in such a specific manner? Why the toy soldier placed with such deliberate care upon the preparation table?" He turned his penetrating gaze toward Margaret, who had begun trembling visibly. "You, madame, have served this household faithfully for 15 years, yet your denial concerning Monsieur Charles's presence in the kitchen proved demonstrably false. Inspector, I wonder if you might investigate whether Monsieur Charles's financial difficulties have perhaps touched others in this household. Servants often receive advances on their wages, did they not? Particularly when family circumstances become dire." Margaret's composure shattered completely. She confessed tearfully that Charles had borrowed considerable sums from her over recent months, promising repayment once his circumstances improved. She had become increasingly desperate as the debts accumulated, and when Charles mentioned needing assistance with the turkey matter, she had reluctantly agreed, believing the arrangement temporary and harmless. Yet Graves stepped forward, his carefully maintained professional demeanour finally surrendering entirely. "If I may speak plainly, sir," he addressed Poirot directly, "the situation extends considerably beyond Monsieur Charles's personal difficulties. Mrs. Ashworth herself faces severe financial straits. The manor's maintenance costs have become increasingly burdensome. The Prime Minister's visit was intended to restore the family's social standing and generate beneficial connections that might improve their circumstances. The missing turkey threatened not merely a dinner, but Mrs. Ashworth's entire strategy for financial recovery." Poirot's eyebrows rose with theatrical interest. "Intriguing. Pray continue." "The toy soldier belonged to Mrs. Ashworth's son," Graves revealed, his voice steady now that he had committed to disclosure. "The boy who died 3 years ago at age 7. She kept it in her private chambers. I observed it there mere weeks ago during my regular duties. That someone placed it deliberately at the crime scene suggests knowledge of Mrs. Ashworth's most intimate grief, knowledge possessed by someone far closer to the family than a common thief." The drawing-room fell silent as Poirot's eyes shifted toward Iris, who had begun weeping again. The scullery maid's sobs became increasingly desperate, until finally she revealed the truth Graves had suspected. Iris was Mrs. Ashworth's illegitimate granddaughter, the daughter of Mrs. Ashworth's deceased son, and a woman from the village, Mrs. Ashworth had secretly arranged for Ash's employment precisely to observe her granddaughter, though she had never revealed the connection. Iris had discovered the toy soldier while cleaning Mrs. Ashworth's chambers and recognised its significance immediately. She helped with the turkey deliberately, Iris confessed between sobs. Not for Charles's gambling debts, but because Mrs. Ashworth needed the insurance money. The turkey was to be reported stolen to her insurance company. Monsieur Charles would receive payments sufficient to clear his debts. Margaret would receive wages owed, and Mrs. Ashworth would secure funds to maintain the manor and continue her life here. I only placed the soldier because I wanted her to know that I understood, that I comprehended her pain regarding my father, that we shared that grief together. Poirot absorbed this revelation with characteristic stillness, his mind clearly working through the implications of motives layered upon motives, each suspect carrying secrets that both concealed and revealed the crime's true nature. Inspector Japp seized upon the confessions with visible relief, his notebook filling rapidly with statements that appeared to conclude the investigation definitively. Here lay the solution, he declared with satisfaction. A conspiracy and a desperation involving Charles's debts, Margaret's complicity, Mrs. Ashworth's financial machinations, and Iris's emotional manipulation. The case would be resolved swiftly. The stolen turkey recovered from the wine cellar where Iris had confirmed its location, and charges filed accordingly before Boxing Day. Yet Poirot raised a restraining hand, his expression troublingly contemplative. "Inspector, you move with admirable speed toward closure. However, I must respectfully suggest that we have not yet arrived at the genuine truth. What we have uncovered are layers of secondary deception, truths that mask deeper falsehoods." Japp's irritation was palpable. "With respect, Poirot, we have clear confessions from multiple parties. The turkey is precisely where the girl indicated it would be. The insurance fraud scheme is evident. What more remains to discover?" "Everything," Poirot replied quietly. "You see, Inspector, a skilled criminal does not necessarily conceal themselves behind silence. Sometimes they conceal themselves behind confession by admitting to crimes they did not entirely orchestrate, thereby obscuring the individual truly responsible." He gestured toward Mrs. Ashworth, who had maintained remarkable composure throughout the revelations, her hands folded precisely in her lap. "Our gracious hostess has said remarkably little throughout this entire proceeding. Is this not curious? A woman's elaborate scheme has been exposed, her financial desperation revealed, her illegal machinations laid bare, yet she offers neither defence nor explanation." Mrs. Ashworth's jaw tightened infinitesimally, the first genuine crack in her carefully maintained composure. "I see no purpose in discussing matters already adequately explained by others, Monsieur Poirot." "Precisely so," Poirot continued, beginning his characteristic pacing once more. "You see, madame, what troubles me most profoundly is the toy soldier itself. Iris claims she placed it to communicate her understanding of your grief regarding your yet a touching sentiment, certainly yet psychologically improbable. Would a young woman, recently employed and uncertain of her position, risk discovery by tampering with a crime scene merely to express emotional solidarity? Or would this action serve a more practical purpose, perhaps deflecting suspicion from the true architect of this crime?" He paused, turning to face Mrs. Ashworth directly. "The insurance fraud was genuine, I suspect. The financial desperation was authentic. Yet Monsieur Charles' involvement in the theft itself may have been considerably more limited than suggested. Graves, you mentioned observing the toy soldier in Mrs. Ashworth's chambers weeks prior. Did you perhaps notice whether it had been recently moved or disturbed?" Graves hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction Poirot's inquiry was taking. "Now that you mention it, sir, the toy had been relocated. Mrs. Ashworth had moved it from the shelf to her bedside table approximately 1 week ago. She seemed particularly melancholic during that period." Poirot's expression grew grave. "Inspector, I begin to suspect that the insurance scheme itself may have been secondary to a far darker purpose. Mrs. Ashworth possessed the key to the larder throughout the evening. She could have moved the turkey herself while creating a facade of conspiracy involving others. Yet why would she involve so many parties in her deception unless those parties served a specific function?" "What are you suggesting?" Japp demanded, his earlier satisfaction visibly crumbling. I suggest, Poirot replied with deliberate slowness, that we have been examining only the surface crime. The true transgression may involve far graver consequences than simple theft. The toy soldier, you understand, was not merely placed, it was positioned as a message. And that message was not directed toward Iris at all, but rather towards someone entirely different. Someone who would recognise its profound significance and understand precisely what Mrs. Ashworth intended to communicate through its presence at the scene of this supposedly elaborate crime. The drawing room seemed to contract around Poirot's words, the atmosphere shifting from relief to something far more ominous. Japp's hand moved instinctively toward his notebook, sensing that the investigation had fundamentally transformed from a case of simple theft into something far more sinister. Mrs. Ashworth's composure finally fractured entirely, her carefully maintained facade crumbling as genuine fear manifested in her trembling hands. "Inspect," Poirot addressed Japp with unusual gravity, "I require information regarding Mrs. Ashworth's late son, the boy to whom the toy soldier belonged. The details of his death, if you would be so kind as to investigate through official channels while we continue our discussion here." Japp departed immediately, his scepticism replaced by urgent comprehension. In his absence, Poirot turned toward Graves with penetrating intensity. "The butler knows more than he has revealed. Am I correct in assuming that you possessed knowledge of circumstances surrounding the young master's death that extended beyond what Mrs. Ashworth publicly acknowledged?" Graves's face had gone ashen. For a prolonged moment, he remained silent, wrestling visibly with questions of loyalty and conscience. Finally, his voice emerged barely above a whisper. "The death was ruled accidental, sir. The boy fell from the bridge near the manor's eastern boundary. Yet there were complications surrounding the circumstances." "Explain," Poirot commanded. "There was another child present that evening," Graves continued reluctantly. "A boy from the village whose family had fallen into poor circumstances. Mrs. Ashworth had been providing assistance to the family through charitable arrangements. The village boy was observed near the bridge shortly before the accident occurred. Rumours circulated regarding whether the fall had been entirely accidental, whether perhaps an altercation between the boys had preceded the tragedy. The toy soldier suddenly acquired entirely new significance. Poirot's expression grew intensely focused as the pieces of a far older puzzle began aligning into terrible coherence. "This village boy, what became of him?" "He disappeared shortly after," Graves explained, "left the area entirely. His family eventually relocated to London, seeking distance from the scandal and suspicion that had consumed them." Mrs. Ashworth's grief transformed into something else over the years, a consuming need to understand precisely what had transpired that evening. Poirot rose abruptly and moved toward a window overlooking the manor's grounds. The frozen landscape beyond seemed to mirror the emotional desolation within the drawing room. Inspector Japp will shortly discover that Mrs. Ashworth's financial desperation was not merely circumstantial. Her investigation into her son's death has consumed her resources for 3 years. She has employed private investigators, pursued legal inquiries, and exhausted her reserves attempting to uncover truth regarding what occurred on that bridge. He turned back toward the assembled household members. The insurance scheme was not merely financial desperation, it was a test, a methodology to determine whether others could be manipulated into complicity, whether people could be induced to participate in an elaborate deception for complicated motivations. Mrs. Ashworth has been searching for the village boy, now a man, who vanished after her son's death. She suspected his identity, believed he had returned to the area under an assumed name, and designed this entire turkey theft as an elaborate trap to force a confession from someone she believed responsible for her child's death. Margaret gasped, comprehension suddenly dawning. "The Harrigan fellow," she whispered. "The man to whom Monsieur Charles owed gambling debts. I never actually met him. Charles described him, but I never—" "Quite so," Poirot interrupted gently. "There is no Harrigan. Charles was instructed to invent this character, to create a fictional creditor whose existence would provide Mrs. Ashworth plausible deniability regarding her true intentions. The toy soldier was never meant as communication to Ira. It was meant as recognition, a signal to whoever discovered it that Mrs. Ashworth knew their identity, that she had finally located the person she believed responsible for her son's death." Japp returned at that moment, his face grave, carrying information that would confirm Poirot's extraordinary deductions. The investigation had pivoted entirely, no longer concerning a stolen turkey, but rather a mother's desperate quest for justice spanning 3 years. A quest that had finally drawn her across the threshold from reasonable investigation into something far darker and infinitely more dangerous. Japp's report confirmed Poirot's deductions with staring precision. The young master had indeed died under circumstances clouded by conflicting accounts, with the village boy, identified as Thomas Whitmore, present at the scene. Whitmore had subsequently disappeared, his family severing all connections to the area within weeks of the tragedy. Official investigation had concluded the death accidental, yet whispers persisted throughout the community regarding possible foul play. Poirot's expression grew contemplative as he absorbed this information. "Inspector, I require your assistance with a rather unconventional methodology. You see, we have established the framework of Mrs. Ashworth's deception, yet one crucial question remains unanswered. Has she succeeded in identifying her suspect? Does she genuinely believe the criminal has been located? Or does uncertainty still plague her?" He turned toward Mrs. Ashworth with a deliberate casualness, his manner shifting into something almost conversational. "Madame, I find myself curious regarding the specific details of your son's toy soldier. Such objects accumulate significance through the memories they embody. Would you last gift this particular toy to your child? Under what circumstances was it presented?" Mrs. Ashworth's response emerged strained and reluctant. "Christmas morning 3 years ago. It was his final Christmas gift. He adored soldiers, military history, all manner of martial subjects. I purchased it specifically because it bore the livery of his favourite regiment." "How singularly poignant," Poirot continued gently, moving closer to her chair. "And the boy who was present during the accident, Thomas Whitmore, did he perhaps share similar interests? Military pursuits, perhaps? Collections of toy soldiers?" Mrs. Ashworth's entire body went rigid. Her hands gripped the armrests with such force her knuckles blanched white. In that single moment of visceral reaction, Poirot perceived confirmation of his hypothesis. She had not merely suspected Thomas Whitmore's involvement. She had possessed evidence of it, knowledge that Whitmore collected precisely such toys, that he had been observed with similar soldiers in his possession. "Graves," Poirot instructed with quiet authority, "perhaps you might examine the wine cellar where the turkey currently resides. I suspect you may discover something beyond the bird itself, something that explains precisely why this location was selected for the theft." The butler departed with visible trepidation. Minutes later, he returned bearing not only the wrapped turkey, but a leather satchel containing documents, photographs, and what appeared to be meticulous records of investigation. Mrs. Ashworth had conducted her own private inquiry into her son's death, accumulating evidence, tracking Thomas Whitmore's movements, documenting his reappearance in London under an assumed name. "You see," Poirot addressed Japp with characteristic precision, "Mrs. Ashworth constructed this elaborate scheme not merely as financial solution, but as psychological weapon. By creating a situation requiring others' complicity, by involving Charles, Margaret, and Iris in her deception, she established a methodology to test reactions. The toy soldier served as catalyst, placed deliberately to observe whether anyone would react with guilty recognition, whether someone would betray knowledge of its true significance." He gestured toward the assembled household members. Notice how Iris wept continuously, her emotions genuine and uncomplicated. Charles attempted deception, but possessed insufficient skill for sustained falsehood. Margaret revealed her participation through nervous confession, yet Mrs. Ashworth herself has maintained careful observation of each reaction, searching for signs of recognition that would confirm her suspect's presence within this very household. Japp's comprehension arrived with startling clarity. "You believe Thomas Whitmore is here? In this house?" "Not merely believe," Poirot corrected, "but know. The question, Inspector, is not whether he is present, but rather how we convince Mrs. Ashworth that pursuing vengeance through deception will prove infinitely more destructive than the justice she imagines herself seeking. For you see, Madame Ashworth," he turned toward her with an expression of profound compassion, "if Thomas Whitmore is indeed present, if he is the very person who has been closest to you throughout this investigation, then you must confront a possibility far more terrible than his guilt. You must confront the possibility that the truth regarding your son's death may differ fundamentally from what your grief has constructed these 3 years past." The drawing room fell into profound silence as Poirot's words suspended themselves in the frozen air. Mrs. Ashworth's face had transformed entirely, her features contorting with a complex amalgamation of denial, desperate hope, and crushing despair. Before anyone could respond, a servant entered hastily, whispering urgently to Graves that a fire had broken out in the library, the room where Mrs. Ashworth maintained her private study and archived the investigative documents she had accumulated regarding her son's death. Japp bolted towards the door, but Poirot remained perfectly motionless, his expression suggesting he had anticipated precisely such a development. "Inspector, the fire is almost certainly incidental to our investigation. However, the documents themselves, those represent the true target. Someone seeks to eliminate evidence before comprehensive exposure becomes inevitable." The group rushed toward the library, where flames were already consuming the wooden shelves with alarming voracity. Yet what struck Poirot most profoundly was not the fire's intensity, but rather its precise location, concentrated entirely upon the section where Mrs. Ashworth's investigation files had been stored. The documents regarding Thomas Whitmore, the photographic evidence, the meticulous accords of his movements and assumed identities, all were being methodically obliterated. Graves moved toward the flames with admirable courage, attempting to salvage what remained, but the heat proved too intense. Most of the evidence transformed into blackened ash before rescue became possible. Mrs. Ashworth stood frozen, watching her 3 years of obsessive investigation literally dissolve before her eyes, her expression suggesting the destruction of something far more vital than mere documents. Once the servants had extinguished the flames and the immediate danger had passed, Poirot conducted a methodical examination of the scene. His keen-bodied observation revealed something profoundly significant. The fire had been deliberately set using accelerants positioned with considerable precision. This was no accident, no outbreak, rather deliberate destruction executed by someone possessing intimate knowledge of the library's layout and Mrs. Ashworth's archival methodology. "Inspector," Poirot declared with unusual intensity, "whoever initiated this fire possessed several crucial characteristics. First, they maintained awareness of the investigative document's location. Second, they possessed sufficient courage to execute destruction in a household presently occupied by multiple witnesses. Third, and most significantly, they acted with this urgency, suggesting they anticipated imminent exposure of information they deemed absolutely vital to conceal." Japp's jaw clenched as comprehension dawned. "You're suggesting the arsonist is someone present in this household, someone who has been aware of Mrs. Ashworth's investigation throughout its entirety." "More than merely aware," Poirot continued grimly. "Someone intimately involved in the very events those documents documented. Inspector, I must ask you to secure the household immediately. No one departs, no communications are transmitted beyond these walls until we have achieved complete clarity regarding events 3 years past." Yet even as Japp issued orders to his constables, a new complication emerged. One of the servants reported that Graves had vanished. The butler, who had been present moments earlier, attempting to rescue documents from the flames, had seemingly disappeared entirely. A cursory search of the manor's accessible areas revealed no sign of him. The back exit near the kitchen remained unsealed, the path toward the village road completely unobstructed. Mrs. Ashworth's anguished cry pierced through the drawing room. "Graves cannot be involved. He has served this household for 25 years. His loyalty has been absolute. There must be explanation." But Poirot's expression suggested he had perceived something others continued overlooking. He retrieved the leather satchel containing Mrs. Ashworth's investigation materials, examining its contents with meticulous care. One document remained partially salvaged from the flames, a photograph depicting 2 young boys, one clearly identifiable as Mrs. Ashworth's deceased son, the other smaller, younger, his features obscured by time and deterioration. "Madame," Poirot said quietly, "I must ask you an extraordinarily difficult question. When your son died 3 years ago, how old was Mrs. Ashworth's response emerged barely audible. 6 years old. Old. He was only 6. The revelation hung suspended in the drawing room like the smoke still drifting through the corridors above. A 6-year-old could not have deliberately murdered another child, could not have orchestrated a conspiracy spanning him for 3 years. Yet someone far older, someone who had been present throughout, someone with intimate knowledge of the household and Mrs. Ashworth's obsessive investigation, had deemed the destruction of those documents worth risking everything. The vanished graves represented not merely a suspect's escape, but rather the dissolution of a critical narrative that had begun forming within Poirot's extraordinary mind. The manor descended in solve to controlled chaos as Japp organised search parties to locate graves, yet Poirot remained oddly unmoved by the butler's disappearance. Instead, he moved methodically through the house, his movements suggesting he was searching for something far more specific than a fugitive. His investigation culminated in the wine cellar, where he stood regarding the wrapped turkey with an expression of profound contemplation. "Inspector," Poirot called upward through the cellar entrance, "I require your immediate presence, and perhaps you might bring Madame Ashworth as well." When the guest arrived, Poirot gestured toward the turkey with deliberate significance. "Unwrap this, if you would be so kind. I suspect its contents may prove considerably more illuminating than a simple bird." The servants carefully removed the burlap wrapping to reveal not merely the turkey, but a second smaller bundle concealed within its cavity. Japp extracted the hidden package with mounting bewilderment, unwrapping it to expose documents, not the burned archives from the library, but rather different papers entirely. Among them lay a letter in handwriting that caused Mrs. Ashworth to emit a strangled cry of recognition. The letter was addressed to her, dear, written in her son's childish penmanship, dated 3 years prior, the very day of his death. Its contents revealed a narrative completely divergent from what Mrs. Ashworth's grief-stricken investigation had constructed. The young master had not been a victim of violence, but rather had orchestrated an elaborate escape, assisted by Thomas Whitmore and, most significantly, by Graves himself. "Impossible!" Mrs. Ashworth whispered, as her entire comprehension of 3 years' tragedy collapsing entirely. "My son wrote this, but he died. The body was identified." The funeral, Poirot interrupted gently, was conducted under considerable emotional distress. Identifications made by family members consumed by grief are relatable. Inspector, I suspect examination of cemetery records will reveal that the casket contained something considerably lighter than a human body, perhaps weighted with stones, perhaps with objects designed to suggest appropriate mass during a funeral service. The revelation hung suspended as its implications cascaded outward like dominoes. The letter explained that the young master had been desperately unhappy, had orchestrated his own disappearance with the assistance of Graves, who had harboured his own complicated reasons for facilitating the escape. Thomas Whitmore, merely 6 years old, had been present purely by coincidence, his presence at the bridge the result of innocent childhood wandering rather than malice. Yet before Mrs. Ashworth could fully process this devastating revelation, a servant rushed into the cellar with urgent news. Charles Ashworth had been discovered in the manor's east wing, severely beaten, his condition critical. He had apparently regained consciousness long enough to communicate that Graves had attacked him, believing Charles possessed knowledge that threatened to expose secrets far more dangerous than theft or arson. Japp cursed vividly and bolted towards the east wing, his constables following in rapid succession. But Poirot remained with Ashworth, understanding that the true devastation extended far beyond physical violence. The woman had constructed her entire existence around pursuit of her son's murderer, had sacrificed her financial security, her emotional well-being, her relationships, all based upon a tragedy that had never occurred as she imagined it. "Where is my son?" she demanded, her voice fracturing with desperate hope and terrible uncertainty. "If he did not die, if he escaped, where has he been these 3 years? Why has he not contacted me? Why would he allow me to suffer such anguish?" Poirot's response emerged with characteristic gravity. "Madame, I fear the answer to those questions may prove even more painful than the tragedy you have spent years investigating. You see, Graves did not merely assist your son's escape. I suspect he became your son's guardian, his protector, his father figure in all respects save blood. And when your investigation began drawing dangerously close to exposing the truth, Graves believed himself protecting not merely the boy's secret, but the boy himself from a mother whose grief might prove more destructive than the original deception." Japp's voice echoed from the corridor above, announcing that Graves had been apprehended attempting to flee the manor's eastern boundary, and that Charles, though severely injured, would survive. Yet the most crucial discovery remained unaided, the location of Mrs. Ashworth's son, now a young man of 10 whose existence had become a carefully guarded secret that multiple parties would kill to conceal. As Japp coordinated the apprehension of Graves in the manor's entrance hall, Poirot stood perfectly motionless in the wine cellar, his eyes fixed upon the letter with an expression suggesting he perceived significance others had overlooked entirely. His fingers traced the childish handwriting with meticulous care, and suddenly his entire posture shifted. A subtle transformation that signalled revelation of extraordinary magnitude. "Inspector," Poirot called upward, his voice carrying unusual urgency, "before you conduct your interrogation of Graves, I must share an observation that may fundamentally alter your understanding of this entire investigation." Japp descended the cellar stairs with evident irritation, his attention divided between Poirot's cryptic announcement and the pressing, practical matters demanding his immediate attention. Yet when Poirot presented the letter with deliberate slowness, directing the inspector's attention towards specific passages, comprehension began manifesting in Japp's expression. The handwriting, Poirot explained with characteristic precision, belongs not to a child of 7 years, but rather to an individual considerably older. Observe the formation of these letters, the sophistication of penmanship, the controlled spacing, the mature construction of complex thoughts. This letter was written by someone who had reached adolescence, perhaps 13 or 14 years of age, attempting to counterfeit the script of a younger child. He turned the document toward the light, revealing additional details invisible to casual observation. Furthermore, notice the dates inscribed here. Multiple iterations, as though the author struggled to determine which date would prove most credible. The letter itself contains contradictions regarding the circumstances of escape, inconsistencies that suggest composition by someone constructing a false narrative rather than recounting genuine events. The implications crystallized with devastating clarity. The letter was not authentic documentation of the young master's escape, but rather an elaborate fabrication. A secondary deception layered atop the original mystery. Someone had created this false letter, had hidden it within the turkey as part of Mrs. Ashworth's elaborate scheme, had designed it specifically to be discovered at a moment calculated to redirect investigation away from truths even more damaging than murder. But who would construct such a deception? Japp demanded, his investigative instincts finally aligning with Poirot's extraordinary perception. Who possesses both the knowledge and the motivation to observe the details of a Christmas morning 3 years ago? Poirot interrupted, gesturing toward Mrs. Ashworth's investigation materials that Graves had partially salvaged from the library fire. Margaret mentioned preparing special meals that evening. The cook possessed knowledge of the household's routines, understood the family dynamics, recognised opportunities for elaborate schemes. Yet notice also how she insisted upon her innocence regarding Monsieur Charles's presence in the kitchen, how her denial seemed calculated to obscure something far more significant than simple complicity and theft. Poirot's pacing accelerated as his mind clearly assembling fragments into comprehensive coherence. The toy soldier placed at the crime scene. We assumed it communicated to Iris regarding her grandfather's grief. Yet what if its purpose extended far differently? What if it served as signal to someone whose involvement predated even Mrs. Ashworth's investigation into her son's death? Someone who required confirmation that the deception remained undiscovered? He pivoted toward the staircase with sudden intensity. "Inspector, I must speak with Margaret immediately. Not regarding the turkey theft, but concerning events 3 years past. Her precise whereabouts on the evening of the young master's supposed death, her relationship with Graves, her knowledge of circumstances that precipitated the original tragedy." As they ascended toward the kitchen, Poirot's voice continued with methodical precision. "You see, the pattern that emerges from careful examination suggests that Graves did not act independently. He possessed an accomplice. Someone within the household who shared both knowledge of the young master's unhappiness and motivation to facilitate his escape. Someone whose financial circumstances were precarious, whose future prospects seemed desperately uncertain, who might have viewed the situation as opportunity rather than tragedy." Margaret stood near the kitchen's preparation table when they entered, her composure visibly deteriorating as Poirot's penetrating gaze settled upon her. Before Japp could pose any formal question, the cook's shoulders collapsed inward, and she began weeping with the intensity of someone who had carried unbearable secrets for precisely 3 years. "I didn't mean for it to happen this way," she confessed in a trembling voice. When the young master asked for help, when Graves explained the situation, I thought I was being merciful. The boy was genuinely suffering. His mother's attention was suffocating him. We believed a brief disappearance, a period of separation, might restore his well-being. We never anticipated that Mrs. Ashworth would spiral into such consuming obsession that her investigation would become an all-consuming destruction of her own life. The confession hung suspended as its implications cascaded through the investigation's entire architecture, revealing that the Christmas turkey mystery concealed not one deception, but rather multiple interlocking conspiracies spanning 3 years, conspiracies that had begun with genuine compassion and sorrows and metastasized into something far more complex and morally ambiguous than simple criminality. Margaret's confession unravelled gradually, each revelation peeling away layers of carefully constructed justification and buried trauma. She explained that 3 years prior she had discovered the young master in the kitchen late one evening, his small face streaked with tears, his words tumbling forth of his desperate confession. The boy had spoken of suffocating expectations, of maternal demands he felt incapable of meeting, of a pervasive sense that his existence represented disappointment rather than joy to the woman who had birthed him. He was only 7 years old, Margaret wept, her voice fracturing with the weight of 3 years' concealment. Yet he articulated such profound anguish. He spoke of wishing he could simply disappear, that his mother might finally achieve peace without the burden of his presence. I comforted him as best I could, but his distress seemed genuine and absolute. When Graves discovered our conversation, he understood immediately. He possessed his own reasons for sympathizing with the boy's desperation. Poirot gestured for her to continue, understanding that the pattern extending beneath this confession reached towards something even more significant than parental dysfunction or childhood trauma. Graves and yourself, you constructed the escape together, is this correct? You created the fiction of accidental death as camouflage for the boy's disappearance? Graves had resources I did not possess, Margaret continued, her words now flowing with the relief of finally surrendering secrets that had poisoned her existence. He maintained connections to individuals outside the household, people who operated in chateaux beyond legitimate society. Through these connections, arrangements were made. The boy was spirited away to Scotland, placed with a distant family whose circumstances aligned with his need for anonymity. Graves visited him regularly, maintained his education, ensured his well-being. Japp's expression darkened with comprehension of the deception's scope. And the funeral, the body that was supposedly identified as the young master. A cadaver obtained through undertaker connections, Margaret confirmed quietly. A child who had died of natural causes, whose family possessed no resources for elaborate funeral arrangements. The exchange was conducted with remarkable discretion. Mrs. Ashworth, consumed by her initial grief, never questioned the arrangements Graves made. Her mind accepted the tragedy because her emotional state could tolerate nothing else. Yet Poirot raised a restraining hand, sensing that Margaret's confession, while addressing certain aspects of the deception, continued obscuring the genuine motive that had driven Graves to such extraordinary measures. You've explained how the escape was facilitated, madame, but not why. What possessed a butler of long standing to risk everything, his position, his reputation, potentially his freedom, on behalf of a child whose suffering, while genuine, might have been addressed through considerably less dramatic interventions? Margaret's weeping intensified, her entire frame trembling as she approached the revelation that apparently constituted the most devastating aspect of her 3-year burden. Because, she whispered, each word seemingly extracted from her with tremendous effort, the boy was not merely any child. The young master was Graves's biological son. The statement transformed the investigation's entire moral architecture. Japp's expression suggested he was reconstructing years of household dynamics with this revelation as foundational truth. Poirot, however, merely nodded with the expression of someone whose extraordinary deductive capabilities had anticipated precisely this disclosure. 26 years ago, Margaret continued, her voice now assuming the quality of historical recitation, Graves maintained a relationship with a woman employed as chambermaid in this household. When she became pregnant, Mrs. Ashworth's predecessor dismissed her without reference or compensation. The woman died giving birth to the child who was raised in poverty by relatives in the village. Graves could never acknowledge the connection publicly. His position, his reputation, his entire existence depended upon maintaining professional discretion. She paused, gathering strength for the final revelation. Yet when the young master displayed such profound anguish, when Graves perceived that the boy possessed no one to truly understand his desperation, the butler recognized an opportunity to finally establish the paternal connection he had been denied. The escape was not merely rescue of a suffering child. It was a redemption of Graves's own fractured life, his chance to father the son he had always loved from distance, but never could acknowledge. The kitchen fell into profound silence as the true architecture of the crime revealed itself, not as malevolence, but as desperate humanity attempting to navigate impossible circumstances, as love expressed through deception, as a man's lifetime of longing, finally finding outlet through an act that simultaneously protected a child and destroyed a mother's existence. The Christmas turkey mystery had never truly been about theft at all, but rather about the profound lengths to which individuals would venture when confronted with the collision between paternal love and societal obligation. Graves was brought into the manor's drawing room under police escort. His dignified composure maintained despite the weight of accumulated revelations that now surrounded him. Like an inescapable web, Japp positioned himself near the doorway, with characteristic official rigidity, yet Poirot moved with theatrical deliberation toward the fireplace, his movements suggesting a man, conducting a carefully orchestrated performance rather than a routine criminal interrogation. "Monsieur Graves," Poirot began, his voice carrying unexpected gentleness. "You have served this household with exemplary dedication for 25 years. Your professional competence has been repeatedly praised. Your discretion has never been questioned. Yet beneath this impeccable facade existed a truth so profound, so personally significant, that you were willing to construct an elaborate deception spanning 3 years to orchestrate the apparent death of a child, to risk everything you had built." Graves remained perfectly motionless, his features betraying no emotion. Yet his hands gripped the chair's armrest with sufficient force to suggest the tremendous effort required to maintain his composure. Poirot continued with unrelenting precision, laying out the complete architecture of the deception with the methodical clarity of a man assembling a jigsaw puzzle whose final image revealed unexpected beauty alongside undeniable criminality. "The turkey theft was not your design," Poirot explained, gesturing toward Mrs. Ashworth, who sat rigidly in her chair, her expression suggesting she remained processing the devastating reconstruction of her son's existence. Madame Ashworth orchestrated that particular scheme, hoping to identify whoever possessed knowledge of her obsessive investigation. Yet when you recognized the true danger, when you understood that her relentless pursuit of truth regarding Thomas Whitmore might eventually lead toward discoveries concerning your own son, you acted with the singular-mindedness of a father protecting his child. He moved toward Graves with slow, deliberate steps. You positioned the toy soldier as the warning to Margaret, her dear, signaling that the conspiracy required immediate action. You set the library fire, not merely to destroy Mrs. Ashworth's investigative documents, but to eliminate evidence that might eventually expose your biological relationship to the boy you claimed was merely your professional ward. You assaulted Charles Ashworth not from malice, but from this desperate calculation that he might possess knowledge threatening your son's continued anonymity. Graves finally spoke, his voice emerging steady despite the obvious emotional turbulence beneath his controlled exterior. The boy required protection, not merely from circumstances, but from a mother whose love had become suffocating obsession. You cannot comprehend, Monsieur Poirot, what it signifies to love someone with the intensity of paternal devotion while being unable to acknowledge that love, to watch that child suffer while constrained by professional obligations that demand silence. "On the contrary," Poirot replied with surprising compassion, "I comprehend perhaps more completely than you imagine. Yet understanding does not eliminate the fundamental reality that your actions, however motivated by genuine paternal concern, constitute criminal conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and assault upon a member of this household." He paused, allowing the gravity of his statements to settle across the drawing room. "However, I must also acknowledge that the young man you protected has apparently flourished in Scotland. His education has proceeded admirably. His psychological well-being, despite the fees' tragic circumstances surrounding his relocation, appears substantially superior to what it would have been had he remained in this household subject to his mother's consuming obsession with his happiness. Japp shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing that Poirot was moving beyond conventional criminal investigation into territory where justice and mercy became uncomfortably entangled. The detective's next statement confirmed this impression entirely. Inspector, Poirot addressed Japp with unusual formality. I must ask you to consider whether the most appropriate resolution to this investigation involves conventional, legal proceedings, or whether other approaches might serve justice more effectively. The crime committed here was undoubtedly serious, yet the motivations underlying that crime reflect something almost noble. A man's desperate attempt to rescue his biological son from circumstances he perceived as genuinely harmful. Graves's composure finally fractured, tears streaming silently down his weathered face as he confronted the reality of his situation. He had spent 3 years protecting his son, had sacrificed his position and reputation, had constructed elaborate deceptions, all motivated by love expressed through deception. Now that love faces judgment not through the mechanisms of conventional law, but through something far more complex and complex. Poirot's extraordinary capacity to perceive moral truth beneath criminal actions, and his willingness to advocate for justice that transcended simplistic legal categories. The final confrontation resolved not through dramatic confession or desperate escape, but through quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the most profound crimes originate from these deepest human emotions, and that sometimes solving mysteries requires understanding that villains and heroes occupy, but not opposite poles, but rather ambiguous territory where categorical judgments become impossible to maintain. As Japp began preparing documentation for Graves's formal arrest, Poirot remained standing before the fireplace, his expression suggesting that despite the apparent resolution, something fundamental continued troubling his extraordinarily perceptive mind. His fingers drummed against the mantelpiece with irregular rhythm, a tell that those who had worked with him recognized as signifying incompleteness, the sensation that a final piece of the puzzle remained undiscovered. Inspector, Poirot announced quietly, before we proceed with formal charges, I require clarification regarding a detail that has persistently troubled my investigation. The toy soldier placed at the crime scene, we have established that Graves did not position it. Margaret has confirmed she played no role in its placement. Yet someone deliberately chose that specific object, someone who possessed intimate knowledge of Mrs. Ashworth's private grief regarding her deceased son. He turned toward the assembled household members with penetrating intensity. The toy soldier was not placed by Graves as warning to Margaret. It was positioned deliberately to communicate something far more significant. A message intended for someone specific, someone whose understanding of its symbolic importance would be immediate and devastating. Mrs. Ashworth's head suddenly lifted, her tear-stained face registering dawning comprehension. "Iris," she whispered, her voice fracturing with recognition. The toy soldier was intended as communication to Iris, but not in the manner we initially theorized. Poirot's expression suggested confirmation of her deduction. He gestured for Iris to come forward, and the young scullery maid's entire frame began trembling with visible anxiety. Yet when she approached, Poirot's tone remained unexpectedly gentle, suggesting he understood something about Iris that extended far beyond her apparent role as Margaret's reluctant accomplice in the theft scheme. "Iris," Poirot began with careful precision, "you claim to be the illegitimate granddaughter of Mrs. Ashworth, the child of her deceased son and a village woman. Yet there exists a temporal impossibility embedded within that narrative. So, Ashworth's son died 3 years ago at age 7. You are presently approximately 15 years old, which would require your conception when Mrs. Ashworth's son was merely a young child himself." Iris's composure collapsed entirely, and she sank into a chair, her entire body convulsing with sobs. "I am not her granddaughter," she confessed between desperate gasps for breath. "I am her daughter, her illegitimate daughter, my daughter, conceived when she was young, before she married. She has kept this secret her entire life, maintained the fiction that I was the grandchild of her supposedly deceased son, because acknowledging my existence would have destroyed the carefully constructed narrative of her respectable life. The revelation transformed the investigation's moral landscape entirely. Japp's expression registered shock, that gave way to comprehension as he began reconstructing Mrs. Ashworth's biography with this fundamental truth as foundation to the book. Mrs. Ashworth herself sat frozen, her entire ballade ridge as though she had become statue rather than woman. Graves discovered this truth years ago. Oh. You go, Iris continued, her words now flowing with the relief of finally surrendering the burden of terrible knowledge. He encountered documents, letters, evidence of your existence and your relationship to Mrs. Ashworth. Rather than exposing this secret, Graves recognised opportunity for leverage. He suggested that you be employed here as the household servant, positioned to observe your biological mother, to understand the woman who had abandoned you. He manipulated you into complicity with the theft, because he required your assistance to retrieve specific documents from the library, documents that would have revealed both your existence and his biological paternity of the young master. Poirot's voice emerged with a characteristic precision. Monsieur Graves possessed not one secret to conceal, but rather two. His relationship to the young master represented merely the surface deception. Far more significantly, he possessed knowledge of Mrs. Ashworth's illegitimate daughter, knowledge that granted him extraordinary leverage over the household's matriarch. The fire in the library was designed not merely to destroy her investigative documents regarding Thomas Whitmore, but to eliminate evidence of your existence, Iris, evidence that would have shattered the fiction upon which Mrs. Ashworth had constructed her entire identity. Mrs. Ashworth's composure disintegrated entirely as she confronted the reality that her most carefully guarded secret had been exposed not through conventional investigation, but through Poirot's extraordinary capacity to perceive the psychological architecture underlying criminal deception. The Christmas turkey mystery had never truly been about a stolen bird at all, but rather about secrets layered upon secrets, about a woman's desperate attempt to maintain respectability while surrounded by truths that threatened to obliterate the very foundation of her constructed identity. The drawing room fell into profound silence as the architecture of 3 decades accumulated deception collapsed into rubble. Japp stood rigidly, his investigative certainty shattered by revelations that rendered conventional criminal procedure inadequate to address the psychological and moral complexities now exposed, yet Poirot remained perfectly composed, his expression suggesting he had anticipated precisely this denouement from the investigation's earliest moments. Inspector, Poirot began gesturing toward the assembled household members with theatrical deliberation. Permit me to reconstruct the investigation's trajectory with complete clarity, illuminating the hidden clues that guided my deductions toward this inevitable conclusion. He moved toward the fireplace with characteristic precision. The toy soldier represented the investigation's true focal point from its initial discovery. Everyone assumed it communicated regarding Mrs. Ashworth's grief concerning her deceased son, yet observe its precise positioning upon the preparation table, deliberately placed where it would be discovered immediately, where its symbolic significance would be recognized by specific individuals possessing particular knowledge. Margaret perceived it as warning signal from Graves, yet I recognized it as something far more profound, acknowledgement of a terrible irony. Poirot retrieved the wooden figure from the mantelpiece where it had been preserved. This toy soldier belonged not to Mrs. Ashworth's son, but rather to her illegitimate daughter, Iris herself. Graves had observed this toy in Iris's personal quarters, recognized its distinctive characteristics, and deliberately positioned it at the crime scene as a cryptic message, conveying that he possessed complete knowledge of her identity and her relationship to Mrs. Ashworth. The toy soldier functioned as subtle threat as a reminder that Graves maintained leverage capable of destroying everyone within this household simultaneously. He turned toward Graves with expression combining respect and condemnation in equal measure. You orchestrated this entire investigation, Monsieur Graves. You manipulated Mrs. Ashworth's grief into obsessive investigation of Thomas Whitmore, calculating that her focus would remain directed toward discovering her son's supposedly true killer, rather than examining the secrets concealed within her own household. You positioned Margaret as a reluctant accomplice, knowing her complicity in your original deception rendered her vulnerable to manipulation. You employed Iris as unwitting instrument, suggesting she possessed knowledge of your paternal relationship to the young master, when in fact your primary motivation involved concealing her own existence. Japp's voice emerged hoarse with comprehension. You used the Christmas turkey theft as mechanism to control everyone simultaneously. You created leverage over Mrs. Ashworth through her obsessive investigation, maintained power over Margaret through her guilt regarding the boy's disappearance, and weaponized Iris's identity as insurance against exposure of your biological paternity. Precisely so, Poirot confirmed with grim satisfaction. The insurance fraud scheme Mrs. Ashworth conceived represented precisely the opportunity Graves required. By appearing to participate in her deception, while simultaneously orchestrating events that would expose her manipulation, he positioned himself as an indispensable figure whose cooperation became prerequisite for maintaining household stability. The assault upon Charles, the library fire, all represented tactical manoeuvres designed to demonstrate Graves's willingness to employ violence, thereby reinforcing his psychological dominance over the entire household. Yet as Japp prepared to take Graves into formal custody, Poirot raised a restraining hand with unexpected urgency. "Inspector, before we conclude this investigation with conventional justice, I must present information that will substantially complicate any legal proceedings." He gestured toward Margaret with unusual compassion. "Madame has committed to providing comprehensive testimony regarding the young master's escape and current location in Scotland. The boy, now young man, has thrived under Graves's paternal guidance. His psychological well-being, his educational achievements, his apparent contentment with his circumstances all suggest that Graves's deception, however criminal in technical terms, has produced genuinely beneficial outcomes for the individual it purported to harm." Poirot's attention shifted toward Mrs. Ashworth and Iris, whose relationship had been irrevocably transformed by the revelation. Furthermore, Mrs. Ashworth now confronts the reality that her biological daughter has been present within her household for months, disguised as servant while secretly observing her maternal figure from position of concealment. The psychological consequences of this knowledge will prove considerably more devastating than any legal proceeding could accomplish. He turned finally toward Japp. "Justice, Inspector, does not always manifest through criminal conviction. Sometimes it emerges through the exposure of truth, through forced confrontation with the consequences of one's actions, through understanding that deception inevitably produces suffering for all parties involved. Graves will face legal consequences for his crimes. This is inevitable and appropriate. Yet the genuine punishment he has inflicted upon himself extends far deeper than any judicial sentence could penetrate. He has destroyed the respectability he spent 3 decades constructing. He has exposed himself as manipulator and blackmailer. He has ensured that the son he sought to protect will forever understand that his father achieved paternal reunion through systematic deception and psychological coercion. The Christmas turkey mystery resolved not through dramatic revelation of hidden culprit, but through acknowledgement that sometimes the most profound injustices perpetrate themselves beneath facades of reasonable motivation, that sometimes villains possess sympathetic qualities rendering moral judgment impossibly complicated, and that sometimes the detective's greatest wisdom involves recognizing that legal justice represents only one dimension of a far more complex human reckoning. As the afternoon light began its gradual descent towards evening, transforming the manor's stone walls into amber-hued facades, Poirot prepared his departure from Ashworth Manor with characteristic deliberation. Japp had departed hours earlier, escorting Graves toward London and the formal legal proceedings that would determine his fate through mechanisms of conventional justice. Yet Poirot lingered, his analytical mind apparently engaged with thoughts extending beyond the investigation's apparent conclusion. He stood in the drawing-room's entrance, his coat draped around his armour, his eyes surveying the household members who had been irrevocably transformed by his revelations. Mrs. Ashworth sat rigidly in her chair, her attention focused upon Iris with an expression suggesting she was attempting to perceive her biological daughter within the scullery maid's features. Margaret had been permitted to remain in the household, though her role had fundamentally altered. No longer merely cook, but rather keeper of secrets that had shaped 3 decades of institutional deception. Charles recovered in an upstairs chamber. His injuries substantial but not life-threatening. His understanding of household dynamics shattered by revelations he continued, processing with visible difficulty. "There remains one matter," Poirot announced quietly, his voice carrying that particular quality suggesting he had perceived something others continued overlooking. "That warrants clarification before to mean departure." Everyone's attention shifted toward him immediately, their expressions registering mingled relief and trepidation at the prospect of additional revelations. Poirot withdrew a small notebook from his jacket pocket, not the investigative document he had consulted throughout the case, but rather a personal journal of considerably more ancient vintage. During my examination of Graves's personal quarters, Poirot explained, I discovered the witness maintained by Graves throughout his 3 decades of service to this household. It contains entries documenting his observations, his emotional struggles, his gradual construction of the elaborate deception that culminated in the Christmas turkey theft. Yet there exists within these pages a final entry dated precisely 1 week before my arrival at Ashworth Manor that presents a puzzle I've been unable to resolve with complete satisfaction. He opened the journal to a specific passage, his eyes scanning its contents with visible perplexity. Graves writes of receiving a letter from an individual he identifies only as the other witness. According to his notation, this person possesses knowledge of events surrounding the young master's supposed death, knowledge that extends beyond what Margaret A. Graves or even her Mrs. Ashworth herself comprehend. Furthermore, Graves indicates that this individual has been threatening to expose the entire conspiracy unless specific financial demands are satisfied. Japp's voice echoed in recollection. But we have accounted for all parties possessing knowledge of the deception. Margaret, Graves, and Ms. Ashworth herself constitute the complete architecture of the conspiracy. Precisely, Poirot replied, with characteristic precision. Yet Graves's journal suggests otherwise. He references correspondence received from someone he calls T.W., initials that obviously suggest Thomas Roy Whitmore, the village boy we presume to be merely innocent bystander to the tragedy. Yet here presents curious inconsistency. Thomas Whitmore was only 6 years old when the young master disappeared. How could a 6-year-old child possess knowledge sufficiently comprehensive to enable extortion? Mrs. Ashworth's breath caught audibly, comprehension manifesting in her expression with visible force. Unless, she whispered, Thomas Whitmore was not merely present at the bridge that evening, unless he witnessed not an accidental death, but rather something deliberately orchestrated. The drawing room fell into profound silence as the implications cascaded outward like dominoes in perpetual descent. If Thomas Whitmore possessed evidence of genuine culpability regarding the young master's original disappearance, then the investigation's carefully constructed narrative, that Graves had orchestrated the escape from compassionate motivation, required fundamental reconstruction. The toy soldier, the library fire, the assault upon Charles, all might represent not Graves's desperate protective measures, but rather calculated responses to blackmail threat, originating from a source far more dangerous than any authority figure. Poirot's expression grew contemplative as he gazed toward the frosted windows overlooking the manor's grounds. Inspector Japp has concluded his investigation and departed toward London. The formal legal proceedings will commence without delay. Yet I find myself contemplating whether we have truly solved this mystery, or merely addressed its visible manifestations while permitting the genuine architect of these events to remain concealed in shadows beyond conventional investigation. He turned toward his assembled audience with expression suggesting both satisfaction and profound unease. The Christmas turkey has been recovered, thieves have been apprehended, secrets have been exposed. Justice in its imperfect fashion appears to have been served. And yet, he paused deliberately, allowing his final words to settle across the drawing room with deliberate weight, I cannot escape the sensation that somewhere in Scotland, a young man who calls himself Thomas Whitmore awaits confirmation that his carefully constructed blackmail scheme has achieved precisely the psychological devastation he intended. The mystery, I fear, has merely transformed into something considerably more sinister, and the investigation may be only beginning. With that cryptic observation, Poirot collected his possessions and departed Ashworth Manor, leaving behind questions that would haunt the household far longer than any conventional criminal conspiracy could accomplish.